Thank you, John. So if anyone does have any questions, I appreciate that you are all on mute because it's easier in terms of feedback, etc. However, there is a chat function, so if you do have any questions that you'd like answered, and we have a couple coming in already. So John, what causes the dip from the peak of enlightenment through to the trough?
Well, the dip is caused by encountering obstacles. So whenever we come across something new, we can get excited about how wonderful it is. But when we try to apply it, we find that it's incompatible with the current way of doing things. That it overlaps with, or there are gaps between that and what we're currently doing. It might be that we've got, God forbid, silos in our organization, which we need to span with these new things. The boundaries between the silos don't match up with the new way of looking at things. And so there are all these obstacles and hiccups and barriers to overcome before we can get any net benefits in practice when we apply the thing at scale. We might be able to perform experiments which demonstrate the advantages. We might be able to do small-scale pilots which achieve the advantages, but that isn't adequate. There are all sorts of obstacles, and the overcoming of the obstacles is often more difficult than the identification of the advantages in the first place. Getting a bit of feedback here. And for example, when a new innovation comes along, the advantages that it has in different fields of application are often very similar to one another, but the obstacles are often fundamentally different and very specific to the area of application in which it's being applied. And new innovations don't necessarily take off in all of the areas where they're initially perceived to be advantageous. Does that answer the question?
I think that sounds quite comprehensive, but do come back to us. Yes, thank you. We've also had a question. This seems like quite a complex area to get right, let's be honest. So do you know of any organizations that are actually really good at strategizing innovation?
Well, in my view, there are a couple of whole industries which are far more effective at innovation and far more mature at their application of these innovation techniques than others. And there are one or two individual companies in other industries which are pretty effective too. But there are two industries that I would identify as being effective. One is pharmaceuticals, which if you look at how they're obviously, partly through regulatory requirements, are required to not only test that their products can produce some advantages, but have to put them through clinical trials to make sure that all the side effects are taken account of and all the statistics around that at scale before they can, before they're allowed to sell the things. And there's an example of a fairly sophisticated process. And also, because they have limited life on their products, they have to be continually inventing new ones through which you have to go through this process. Another industry which I think is very effective is aviation. If you look at the complexity of introducing new things into aviation and yet their capability to do that effectively, I know we've had a big hiccup just recently with Boeing and MCAS, but that's quite rare. I mean, I won't go into details, but there are some very sophisticated processes used in aviation to ensure that experimental and test things are done in a safe environment, and then they're developed and rolled out in a safe way.
I think it's interesting what you said about the pharmaceutical industry, because obviously that's my historical background, and I know we've got a couple of guys on the line from the pharmaceutical sector as well. And you're right, I think while we're really innovative in terms of the R&D side, actually when it comes to the commercial side of the organisation, it's almost like operating in quite a different way. You don't have that kind of drive for continual improvement perhaps that the other part of the organisation does, which I think kind of talks to your point that you can have quite different areas, and some areas can be more laggards and some can be real focused individuals, and kind of being able to learn the lessons almost between different parts of the organisations would probably be a huge benefit.
Yeah, definitely. You know, we can't be on the bleeding edge in all areas of our operations, and the early adopters are on the bleeding edge, right? the early majority are on the leading edge, right? So if there are benefits to be had, they want to be adopting the thing at that stage. But as I said, you're not going to be in any category for all of your activities. There are going to be some categories when you're in one area and others when you're in other areas, and that's fine, you know. And of course, over time, if you realize that you actually ought to be in a different category, because not only do we adopt too late, sometimes we adopt too early. And so you can change your disposition to innovation over time. But first of all, you need to understand what it currently is, I think.
Thanks, John. So I guess final question from me, if you were to give one piece of advice, and I know that that is huge, and I haven't prepared John for this at all, so he just rolled his eyes at me, but one piece of advice in terms of even maybe a nugget of where to look, a question to ask yourself, a place to get started, you know, what would that be?
It all starts with having a consensus throughout the organization about what innovation is and how it contributes to the achievement of the purpose of the organization. And I mean, we can argue about the definition of what innovation is. I've used this term discontinuous improvement because I think it's about making improvements. Some people would argue with that. They think improvement's some small thing, but it's got to be better. Who was it? It was Marshall Thurber said, different isn't always better, but better is always different or something, you know. So, you know, we need to be doing different things from time to time. But the way to avoid all this talk about failure, I think, is to have a different attitude to the role of innovation. And I would suggest you look at it this way. Presumably, whatever your purpose is, and if you don't know what it is, I'm sorry, you better go find out because I can't help you with that. But assuming we know what your purpose is, presumably you'd like to be achieving that purpose by the most effective means available to you in all respects, large-scale stuff all the way down to the little nuts and bolts. From time to time, the most effective way of achieving whatever it is you're doing will change. It'll change sometimes in smooth, continuous ways, and you can adjust parameters and so on and remain on the peak of effectiveness. But from time to time, there'll be a jump. You know, a different way of doing that thing will come along, and you need to decide which of these opportunities to take, when to take them, how to take them, and so on. And in other words, when to jump from one peak to the next, because there's no in between. There's a gap between. And so to deal with this failure issue, what it's really about is exploring opportunities and figuring out which ones are for you and when to take them, and ruling out the ones that are not for you. And the military have a saying, time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted. To go looking for something in a particular area and find that there's nothing there is not a failure. The only way to know that the technique that you're currently using is the most effective is to know what all the others are and to know that they're less effective. So to go and find another less effective one is not a failure. You're just ticking it off as being not a threat. This is a very different way of looking at failure. So that was my suggestion. Develop a consensus throughout the organization, which everyone can agree with. Because at the moment, you've got different attitudes about why they're doing it. And I think that provides a basis then for looking at the knowledge that the knowledge base that we currently have about innovation and starting to apply that effectively too.
Thanks very much, John. So we will leave it there today. For those of you who are interested, John actually does run Inner Chat on Twitter every Thursday at noon Eastern time. So if you would like to join in that conversation with John on Twitter, he would be more than happy to have you as part of that conversation. So just to say, thank you from Ideas UK.
Well, thank you for me too.
Thanks, John. And if you're not already signed up, then our website, www.ideasusuk.com, or you can follow us on Twitter at IdeasUKOfficial. And if you'd like to get in touch or have something you'd like to share, would like to be involved with the webinar perhaps, or get involved with our Idea of the Year competition, or even just learn more about any of that, then do get in touch. But for now, thank you and goodbye.